Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Pesachim Daf Kuf Yud Gimel through Kuf Yud Tet, 113 to 119. Kuf Yud Gimel. Shlosha Kadosh Baruch Hu Ohavan. Three categories of people are beloved in the eyes of God. Mi she'eno koes, a person who doesn't get angry. Mi she'eno mishtaker, a person who doesn't get drunk. Ume she'eno ma'amid al midotav, and a person who does not insist upon his measure of retribution, but rather if a person offends him, this individual will forgive and forget. Why does God love these people? Well, we don't like anger in the world, we don't want drunkenness in the world, and we want people to be forbearing and forgiving. Kuf Yud Daled. The Mishnah tells us that on the night of the Seder, a person must have shnei tavshilim, that two cooked foods are brought to the table among the ceremonial foods. But the Mishnah doesn't identify what those two food items are. Gemara says, even if it's fish and the egg batter on the fish, that satisfies two foods. Rav Yosef says, no, it has to be two kinds of meat. One in remembrance of the Paschal lamb, and one in remembrance of the Chagiga sacrifice of the 14th of Nisan, which was eaten as the main course on the night of the Seder. Ravina said even a bone and the broth in which it is cooking. In other words, he wasn't especially particular to have two kinds of food. Even the bone and the broth was enough. By tradition, what do we do nowadays? We do the zroa in remembrance of the Pesach, and a beitza, an egg, in remembrance of the Chagiga. Kuf Tetvav, 115. A person should not eat matzah and maror together, wrap them together and eat them simultaneously. And the reason why you shouldn't do this is because nowadays in the post-temple era, matzah is a Torah commandment, whereas maror is only a rabbinic commandment. And the flavor of the rabbinically required maror will nullify the flavor of the biblically required matzah. And as a result, you will have failed to perform the mitzvah of matzah. So what in fact do? We eat matzah distinct, alone. We eat maror on its own. And then, after having done both mitzvot, we do a zecher lemikdash kehillel, a remembrance of the good old days of Hillel sandwich in temple times, and have matzah and maror biyachad together. Kuf tet zayin, 116. Afal pi she'ein charoset mitzvah. The Mishnah says that the primary opinion of the Mishnah is that charoset is not a mitzvah. Ve'ilo mitzvah, but if it's not a mitzvah, why do we have it at all on the night of the Seder? Why is it a ceremonial food if no mitzvah is performed with it? Amar Rabbi Ami mishum kappa. Well, it serves a utilitarian function, namely that the maror has this kappa, this dangerous substance in it, whether it's worms or whether it's just the sharpness, that maror eaten unadulterated could be dangerous to a person's health. And we use the charoset as a condiment for the dipping of the maror in order to blunt the force of this kappa, so that when you eat maror, you eat it safely. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok omer mitzvah. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, however, says that the charoset is in fact a mitzvah. My mitzvah. But what is this mitzvah? Rabbi Levi omer zecher la tapuach. Rabbi Levi says, well, charoset has apples in it, and we're recalling the tapuach, the apple tree, because the Midrash says that the women of Israel in the days of Egypt would give birth tachat tapuach, underneath the apple tree. Rabbi Yochanan omer zecher latit. Rabbi Yochanan says it's remembrance of the mortar for the making of the bricks. Now, why? Because we want to recall the enslavement and the things that were made by our ancestors, Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim. And since this looks like the mortar, so it's zecher latit. Tavlin zecher latevin. And another piece of the puzzle is that the spices are in remembrance of the tevin of the straw used in the making of the bricks. Kuf Yud Zayin. Amar Rava. Kriyat Shema v'Halel Ga'al Yisrael. Sluta Goel Yisrael. My Talmud Rachaminu. There are several brachot which are very similar. When we say Kriyat Shema every day, the next blessing in the morning ends Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael in the past tense. But when we say Shmona Esrei, we say Baruch Atah Hashem Go'el Yisrael in the present tense. Why the difference? Because the Shema, and for that matter the Hallel, are recalling the past glories of Israel and that God was our Redeemer from our dire predicament. Whereas the Shmona Esrei is Rachame, is a begging for mercy, is active prayer for our current travails. And in that respect, we want God to be an active Goel Yisrael in the present tense. Kuf Yudchet, 118. If you belittle the holidays, and in this case we're referring to Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of the festival, which means days 3 through 6 in the diaspora for Pesach, and days 3 through 7 in the diaspora for Sukkot, or days 2 through 6 in Pesach in Israel, and days 2 through 7 in Israel for Sukkot. So if you belittle the Moadot, it's like you worship idols. That's a terrible accusation. Well, clearly the Gemara is trying to push back against those who would not take Chol HaMoed seriously. The text in the Torah says, do not make for yourself a graven image. And then it says you have to safeguard the Chag HaMatzot. So that's the biblical basis for the sermonic idea that you should not belittle the Moadot, and if you do, it's like you worship idols. Kuf Yud Tet. The Mishnah tells us, you're not allowed to have afikoman after the Pesach. Afikoman, the Gemara offers a few interpretation of what it means, but according to the practice of extending the party, gallivanting and extending the party in a drunken and gluttonous fashion with debauchery too, beyond your own home, but to the neighboring homes. And on the night of the Seder, we're being told you are not allowed to do that. Stay home, have a dignified ritual of the Seder, and then call it a night. Don't extend it in a wild and inappropriate fashion. However, the Gemara also understands it to mean dessert foods. So don't have dessert foods after the Pesach, but rather the Pesach shall be in your mouth, or the flavor of the Pesach shall be in your mouth throughout the evening, long after the Seder is over. The Gemara then says, the same thing holds true in the post-temple era, that we have matzah on the night of Pesach, and you should not eat any food items, any dessert items after the matzah. On this basis, we have a piece of matzah at the end of the meal that we now call afikoman. So the word afikoman, which originally was a sinful act and referred to things you were not supposed to do, is now in our jargon, in our lexicon, referring to the piece of matzah that we eat at the end of the meal.